reality, my diamonds that cold. Versace trunks, I hit my backstroke. Knock on the door, she at the back row.
Welcome to part 2 of Houdini Is Hip. In part 1, we introduced you to VFX and what Houdini is, where it's used, what it's used for. In this part, we're going to go about actually installing Houdini, and we're going to be looking at basic navigation inside of Houdini. So before we install Houdini, there are a few things that I think would be useful to know before we begin. So firstly, with installing Houdini, we're going to be installing a particular version. At the time of recording this tutorial, that will be 19.5, but if Houdini 20 is released by the time you're watching this, I will be including anything in a pinned comment as part of this video, just explaining any necessary changes. So if there are any changes that are made that are relevant to this video, I will be updating it down below. So that way we can just kind of keep everything up to date and not have to worry about versions too much. So now we can go straight into it. Let's go ahead onto the computer right over here. We're going to go to sideeffects.com. So sideeffects.com is where we're going to be going to download Houdini. Firstly, let's go over to the Get tab, and we're going to go over to Buy. Now, we're not actually going to buy Houdini right now, but what I would like to explain are the different licensing options. This is something that confuses some people because they're not sure of what the different licenses allow and what the limitations are, and can I do this if I'm using Houdini Apprentice? Can I do this if I'm using Indie, right? Can I follow along? And so I'm just going to explain that quickly. So as you can see, we have Houdini Apprentice. Now, Houdini Apprentice doesn't really have any limitations. The only limitation is when you're rendering out or exporting. The whole purpose of Houdini Apprentice is to give you the full Houdini experience, but limiting you in what you can export so that you can't, sneakily use it for industry work. So you can't use it in a studio because you're going to be limited to a certain size for your renders and it's going to add a watermark. However, everything else is available to you. Houdini Apprentice has the exact same functionality as the fully paid version of Houdini. So as for learning, you're going to be learning in the exact same way if you have the paid version or if you have the Apprentice version. So let's go over to Indie. Now, Indie, this is the license that most people will be using. So what Indie allows is the exact same stuff as Apprentice. So everything in Houdini, but now there's no limitations, right? So you have no limitations at all in what you can do with Indie. However, if you're earning over $100,000 per year, you can no longer use Indie. There are some limitations in terms of how many Indie licenses you can have and things like that. But if you're a single artist, that's not going to be an issue. So Indie is the way to go for most people. And just to understand the rest of them, we have Houdini Core and Houdini FX. So Houdini FX is the full version of Houdini. That's everything, right? If you're working in a studio, you're going to be using an FX license. And that's the most expensive version. So Houdini FX has everything, no limitations at all. That's what you're going to be using if you're working in large studios. Houdini Core is the same thing, but they've removed all of the effects stuff. So they've removed all of the simulation stuff. You can't do things like fluid dynamics and pyro and all of those things. They've kind of cut that out. So that Core is a sort of streamlined version for modeling and procedural generation and tool creation, things like that. So that's all you really need to know. The only other thing is that these three licenses save different file types. So if you're using a Houdini Apprentice license, it will save a .hipnc file. If you're using Indie, it will be a .hipulc. And if you're using effects, it will be just a .hip. That's actually where the name of the series comes from. Houdini Is Hip. It's the file type that you save it as. Each file can be opened in each of the other license types, but all of that's fine for now. It's not really going to be an issue. That is just something that I think you should be aware of. Okay, so let's go ahead and actually install Houdini. So if we go over to Get, and this time we're going to download. Over here, you can fill in your information if you haven't registered already, but I'm just going to log in. And once we log in, you'll notice this over here. We have the launcher and the old installer. Now the launcher, that's what we're going to be using. It is the recommended way to do it. So once the launcher has downloaded, we can go ahead and launch it. And we'll just allow changes to this device. Go ahead and click Next, find a location to install it into and install it. So that's just going to take a second, and that's just the launcher. So this isn't actually the Houdini software. This is just a manager for all of your installations of Houdini. It's a pretty nice tool to just have because it allows you to sort out all of your licenses and it allows you to manage all of your different versions of Houdini from a single place. Once that's done, we can just create a start menu and desktop shortcut. And then we can go ahead and actually use it. So if we open this up over here, we can go to our launcher and let's just launch it. So once we have it open, you'll notice that it says launch Houdini not installed. So that's because we don't have a version of Houdini installed yet. if we want to install a version, we can just go to the right over here and say install Houdini. It will take you to the license login. If you're already logged in, you can just go back to your launcher. Now, there's the production build and the daily build. The production build is the stable version. The daily build is, as the name suggests, a daily build. So this is to fix minor bugs or add small improvements. So we're just going to go with the production build because it is the stable version. And over here, you can choose whichever plugins you want. So if you're using any of those other pieces of software, feel free to use them. But I'm not going to be using that. However, I am going to ensure that I am automatically installing Side Effects Labs. Now, Side Effects Labs is something that's quite interesting. So with Houdini, there is a particular set of tools that are inside of Houdini. However, Labs is a set of experimental tools. So they're not really officially inside of Houdini because they're kind of being tinkered with. So they exist as a sort of standalone set of tools that you can bring into Houdini. And there's some really cool things that they do. They help streamline your processes and they're just really nice workflow tools. So I'm going to ensure that that is automatically installed. And that's it, right? We just say install, say yes, and go ahead and install it. Alright, so once we have Houdini installed, we'll have the option to launch Houdini in the top left or launch a particular version under the Versions tab. Now we're going to go ahead and launch, and this is going to be for 19.5.493. Now, I've already installed an apprentice license. If you haven't, it should bring up an option over here saying that I have a paid license as the one option or install an apprentice license as the second option. You can just go ahead and install an apprentice license and you'll have exactly what I have over here. You can choose to opt into the anonymous usage statistics if you'd like, but once you open Houdini, this is what you'll have, right? This is Houdini and Houdini Effects, Houdini Indie, Houdini Apprentice. They all look the same at this point. So this might be a bit intimidating, right? There's a lot of tabs, a lot of nodes, a lot of little buttons and things, and it can be very intimidating. So what we're going to do is we're going to simplify this down. So if we look at it, we have these three main tabs, right? And in the center, this big one over here, that is our viewport. And that is our 3D scene. So if we're putting in objects and we're creating, say, a room, right? In here is where you'll put all of your objects. So you'll put your chair, you'll put some walls, whatever you have goes into the 3D scene, and that's where it's visualized. Now, in Houdini, everything that you place into your viewport will have a representation of it over here in the object network. Now this window in the bottom right, that is your current network view. At the moment, we're at the object level. Now I'll be explaining contexts and levels a little bit later, but for now, understand that this is where your objects go. So if you have objects, they'll show up over here as nodes. Above that, we have the parameters. So the parameters are linked to the objects, right? So it's the settings for the objects. So to really simplify this, we have our 3D viewport, and everything inside of the viewport is represented as an object over here in our object network, and each of our objects can have their settings controlled up here in the parameters window. So let's break these down further. Let's go ahead and take a look at our viewport first. So our 3D viewport, right? This is where we're going to be spending most of our time. Between these three windows is where we'll probably be spending 90% of our time inside of Houdini. To start with, let's take a look at our viewport. And over here on the left, we have our selector and control handles. Now, these are all of the things for actually controlling the viewport. So if we place something into our scene, so let's say we place a cube and we want it to snap to the grid, we can choose snapping settings over here. Or if we want to transform it, we can switch on our transform handles and move our cube around, right? So those are the settings over there. By default, we have our view mode active. That's that little camera. And that's just the default viewing mode inside of our viewport. And what it allows is for us to move around our 3D scene. So let me take you through some basic navigation. If we left click, then we will tumble or rotate, right? So as you can see, we're tumbling or rotating around our scene. If we right click, we will dolly in and out. So that's like a zoom. And if we middle mouse button and move around, then we'll track. So once again, left click to tumble and rotate, middle mouse to track, and right click to dolly in and out. Alternatively, you can use the scroll wheel to dolly in and out. Now, this is only possible when you're in the view mode, right? The view mode is for moving around, so it's for navigating. However, if we happen to change to the transform handles over here, and you will be using the transform handles to move geometry around, but if we are in that and we try to left click, it'll now try and select And if we middle mouse, it'll select, and if we right click, it'll give us some options. So what we can do is we can hold spacebar, and that will toggle our view mode on. So if we hold spacebar, it'll toggle it on, and we can once again do all of those things. So left click to tumble, middle mouse to track, and right click to dolly. If we want to leave any mode and jump back to our view mode, we can just press escape, and that'll switch us back to that mode. Okay, so that's the absolute basics for navigation. If we go over to the right hand side, so still in our viewport, on the left hand side, we had our selector and control handles. On the right hand side, we have some display options. Now, the display options allow you to change the way that your viewport displays things. Now, this might be useful for visualizers and things. So if we want to visualize, say, the velocity of an object, we have some visualizers over here for doing things like that. But there are also other things, like if you want to hide your grid, things like that, right? So these are all of your display options. And then we have these two up here, right? We have this perspective and no cam. Now, if we use this perspective dropdown, what this does is it allows some presets for our view. So if we want to set our view to a particular view, we can go over here and we can switch between perspective, top viewport, front viewport, right viewport, or the UV viewport. Alternatively, and what I would suggest, is just using your numpad. So 1 for perspective, 2 for top view, 3 for front view, 4 for right view, 5 for the UV viewport, 1 to go back to perspective. And if you double tap a number, it'll do the opposite. So if you press 2 twice, it won't show top, it'll show bottom. So just like that, that's bottom, back, left, right? And so we can go back to perspective, no problem over there. This no cam is for selecting cameras. So when we start adding cameras to our scene, they'll all start showing up over here in this dropdown. Same thing with our lights. So if we have a particular light, you can look from that perspective of the light. So if it's this light over here, we can be looking at our scene from the perspective of that light, all right? So that's some of the options that we have over there. And that's really all you need to know about the viewport, right? So the viewport, we just have our selector and control handles on the left-hand side, and we have our display options on the right-hand side. We have our view modes in the top right-hand corner, and we have our camera and light views in our top right-hand corner. Now, what you will notice at the top of each of these windows, so each of these 3 panels over here, is this OBJ, right? And if we click on each one of these, it'll give us different drop-downs. Now, this is something that's important to understand. Inside of Houdini, we have different contexts, and you can almost think of it as different rooms in a house, right? So you might have a kitchen where you cook. You might have a bedroom where you sleep, right? Each one has a different function, and each one still exists as a piece of a whole. By default, we're at the object level. This is where you place objects into your scene and things like that. But if you want to, say, change materials, so you want to create materials and you want to assign it to your object, then you'd go to the material level, right? So you click over there and you switch to the material level. And as you can see, it now says matte over there and matte at the top, right? So now we're in the material level, and this is where we'll be changing materials and we'll be changing the settings for those materials. So we can just go back to the object level, and again, we're just back at the default. So just a quick overview. Our viewport is a visual representation of the objects that are within our object network in the bottom right, and those objects all have their parameters controlled by the parameter window in the top right. That brings us onto the other panels that exist, which are at the top and bottom of these 3 main panels. At the top over here, we have our shelf tools. This long panel at the top with all of these icons, those are our shelf tools. Now that looks like a lot of icons, and the reason is it's because it's everything that you can do inside of Houdini, pretty much. So all of your things that you would be using can come from your shelf tools. They're just an easy way to access them. So if we want to place a camera, as you can see under lights and cameras, there's a camera. If we want to go over to some particle fluids, we can have some presets. So we can have flip fluid from object. It'll turn a particular object into fluid. And so those are all presets, right? For the most part, we won't actually be using them in the tutorials because a lot of the time we don't really want to be using presets. We kind of want to understand what makes a preset work. So for the most part, we won't be using shelf tools, but just know that those are where your shelf tools exist. At the bottom, we have our timeline. Now the timeline is useful for things like animation or any sort of time-based effects. Also useful for things like simulations. So if we have a simulation that needs to run over time, so if you think about it, right? A cube can exist in time and space and it doesn't do anything. But if we have water and the water's flowing, it only flows over time, right? So that's where things like a timeline really become useful. So this over here represents the number of frames. So as we go along, we're progressing through time. We also have other options over here for things like frame rate, and all of our time-based options exist over here for things like keyframing and playback, right? So all of those things exist down here in our timeline. So that really covers it, right? Viewport, current network level, parameters, shelf tools, timeline. So let's go ahead and actually start to use these over here. So I'm going to start by dropping a cube, and there's a couple of ways that we can do this. Firstly, I'm going to use the shelf tools just to show you how it works. So if we click on the box in the top left and we move into our viewport, you'll notice that we can click and drop a box. If we click, it'll drop it where that red wireframe is, or if we press enter, it'll drop it at the origin. When we say origin, we just mean the 0 coordinate for our scene. So that's right in the middle of our scene, if we want to look at it in that way. So we just press enter and it'll drop it into the center of our scene. So the first thing that you'll notice is this box that's in our scene. And we can now move this box around with our transform handles. So it has automatically switched us from the view mode to our transform handles so that we can move this geometry around. In the bottom right, it's now also added a node. So if this is your first time using Houdini, this might be the first time that you've seen a node. A node is just a set of instructions or a container. So it's a container that holds some sort of information. In this case, our little container holds our box. So over here on the left-hand side is a visual representation of that box object over there. That node contains our box. At the top over here, under the parameters, these parameters control the position of our box in space. And we can actually see how these relate to our box. If we click and drag this box along using our transform handles, this translate over here will change. And you'll notice that it's color-coded based on the axes within our viewport. So over here, we have red, green, and blue. That corresponds to X, Y, and Z. X being this horizontal plane of movement, Y being the vertical plane of movement, and Z referring to depth. So as you can see, X, Y, and Z. And we can just return to our defaults. If we right click on translate, we can very easily just say revert to defaults like that, right? So again, if you move things around and you rotate them, it'll change the parameters for that object, and you can revert it back to default if you want. Okay, so we have that object, and I'm just going to delete it quickly. So we can just select it over here. If we click and drag over it, it'll create a yellow outline around the object as well as in the viewport. And then we can just press delete and delete it. Okay, so that was one way to place a piece of geometry into our scene, right, from the shelf tools. However, at the object level over here in our network, we can press tab, and this will bring up the tab menu. Now the tab menu, much like our shelf tools, has all of the things that we can place into our scene. However, it's now in a list view, and we can also type here to search for things. So if we type box, it'll bring up a box, and we can press enter, and it will allow us to place a box node. Great, so our box is back in our scene. Now, this box over here, you might be wondering, how do we do anything with it? We can move it around and rotate it, but that's not really useful. And so the reason is, it's because we're at the object level. So when we're at the object level, we're seeing containers for particular pieces of geometry. So this node over here is a container containing a box, right? And we can actually test this. We can drop another one over here. We can type sphere, and we can create a sphere, right? And the sphere is hidden over there, but we can move it around, and now we have a container, and this container contains a box, and this container contains a sphere. Now, what do I mean by container? Well, we can go inside of these, and we can make changes to the actual geometry. So if we double click on the box node, we'll dive inside, and inside of here, we have this box geometry node. Now notice, in the top right of our current network view, it now says geometry. If we go up a level, and we can do this by clicking on this OBJ or just pressing back, you'll notice that it says objects, right? We go inside, it says geometry. So we're actually going from the object level into the geometry level, thinking of our box object as a container that contains a box, right? That's how it works. And we can jump up and down levels by using U and I. So U is for up and I is for in. So we can go up a level or inside, right? So once we're in here, we have this box, and you'll notice that our sphere that exists is now ghosted, right? So our sphere does still exist at the object level, but when we're inside our box and we're affecting the geometry inside this box, our sphere kind of just exists outside of this. So that's why it's ghosted, right? It still exists, but we're not editing it currently. In here, right, so now we have our box. You'll notice that the parameters have changed. We have some new parameters for our box because we're changing the actual box geometry. So we can do things like rotating it. So if we rotate over here on the x-axis by 45 degrees, our box is now rotated like that. I'm going to hold space to left click and move around, right? We have that box. If we want to do more to this box, we can start adding nodes. So if we press tab at this level, we can now add a different node. Let's add a color node. So we're going to color this box a different color. Now you'll notice we have a box node and a color node, and nodes work together, right? So the output of one node goes into the input of another node, and this new node works on the input that it's given. So if we take this color node and plug our box into it, it'll change the color of our box. So let's go ahead and plug the box's output into the input of our color node. And when we hover over our color node, it'll say what it requires. So it requires a geometry to color. Okay, so now our box is connected to our color. We can go ahead and change the color over here in this color picker. Again, once we have our color node selected, the parameters change. So the parameters change depending on the node that you have selected. This is the parameters for our box. This is the parameters for our color. So we can go ahead and change the color over here to something like blue. And you'll notice that it hasn't changed the color. And that's because of a thing called display flags. Now, display flags are just a way of letting Houdini know what we want to view. So at the moment, we have our box displayed, right? This node, the box node, is being displayed. But we want to view the color node. So we go ahead and we click the display flag, so the far rightmost button on our color node, and it'll set our display flag. As you can see now, our cube is blue. And we can keep adding nodes to this if we want. So let's go ahead and add something else. Let's add a bevel to this box. We can go ahead and type bevel, and that'll drop a poly bevel node right over there, and we're going to plug our color into the first input. Generally, you'll be plugging into the first input. Second input is for kind of secondary things. So first input is what it'll operate on. Second input is just like some extra information a lot of the time. So we'll go ahead and plug that in. Again, we don't have our display flag on our poly bevel, so we won't see it displayed in our viewport. So we switch our display flag to our poly bevel, and now it'll be showing us the output for our poly bevel, and then we can make changes. So let's add some distance to our poly bevel and a few divisions. And just like that, we have a little beveled cube over there. Looks like an ice cube or something, so that's pretty cool. And this is where the procedural nature of Houdini becomes so impressive. Because if we go ahead and we look at this set of nodes, right, and we want to change something, we can change something upstream. So we can change the color of this to red, right? Or pink, or whatever we want. And in fact, we can even change what's being input. We don't have to use a box. We can add something like a tube. So let's go ahead and create a tube instead. And we're going to take the output of that tube, plug it into our color node. And just like that, it'll do all the same operations, right? So if I add end caps onto my tube using the parameters, it'll now bevel this tube. And it'll do the same operations, right? The entire set of operations, it'll do it now on a tube instead of on a cube. And we can switch between these two, right? And this is the power of proceduralism. It can run through the same set of rules on different inputs, and we can vary the inputs. And the other thing is that it's non-destructive. So we still have access to the original box. If we switch our display flag to it, we have access to the color. If we switch our display flag there, we have access to the bevel, right? We have access to every step of the process. And so if we want to make changes along the way, we can. And we're never losing our starting point. And so if we go up a level, we now have a box that contains this poly-beveled version of our box, right? And at this level, this container represents whatever our display flag is on. So if we go inside and we switch it back to this standalone tube over here and go up a level, that's what will be displayed at this level, right? So the object can only represent a single display flag. So always make sure that your display flags are on the right things. Like, you might be confused, like, why is there a tube in my scene? I'm supposed to have this poly-beveled box that I've been working on. You just have to make sure that your display flag is on the right object. So just like that, and at the object level, we have this over here. And as you can see, we can have multiple objects. And we can hide objects, right? We can hide our sphere, we can hide our box. They also have display flags. But because they act as containers, what we're doing is we're basically hiding the container and all of its contents. So that's what we're doing when we're hiding objects like that. And so another thing to take note of is that when we're moving this object at this level, we're actually moving the container. right? We're not moving the geometry. We can move the geometry as well. So we can do something like a transform inside of here, and we can move it around. So this is a separate node that allows us to control the transformation of this box. And we're moving the actual geometry as opposed to the container. You can see that the container still says that it's all centered and it's at origin, but over here, that's where we've made our transformations. So again, like our sphere, the actual container has been transformed, but in this case with our box, the actual geometry has been transformed. So it's extremely useful to look at Houdini in this way, where we have objects that act as containers, and inside of those containers, we can make changes to the geometry. That's the basics. We're going to be going a lot more in depth in the next part and actually going into some proceduralism and modeling and looking at how to create something a bit more interesting than a random beveled cube and a default sphere. So that brings us to the end for this part. I hope that this helped you out in kind of understanding how Houdini operates when it comes to objects, how we can navigate in our scene, how we can move between our different windows, how we can work in different networks. So yeah, in the next part, as I said, we'll be going more in depth, and so I'll be seeing you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.